skill and luck can both be factors in winning over esports pools, where they have fantasy esports and games like League of Legends, like Csgo, like Dota. And yeah, the skill, you've got to pick out the right players, you've got to model a good team. For example, in team games, you've got to have the strong players, but then get the cheap guys, but are going to do better than expected. You've also got to factor in, there's an element of luck, you know, you've got to figure out who's going to have a good day, who's not going to have a good day. You've got to take a bit of a gamble in that particular sense. But if you do, you can win skins. There's a bunch of different prizes available over there. Now, in esports games, skill and luck are obviously two things that are preoccupations of most of us. A lot of us are thinking about how much skill is involved in winning in an esports game, how much luck is involved with winning an esports game. In a sense, they're counterbalancing forces, because we realize that in some games, the best player doesn't always win, particularly in team games. In some games, there are many very good players, and seemingly it can be luck that decides how good you are. Maybe the meta switches one day, or something about the game changes, or the format means that all the good teams run into each other early on in a bracket, and somehow miraculously an underdog wins the tournament. Now, I was watching a video, it was by Vox, and it was called "Why Underdogs Do Better in Hockey Than Basketball." And as someone who is a pretty big aficionado, at least traditionally with hockey, especially now with basketball, these are two games where it had been something I'd noticed myself, that you get a lot of turnover in terms of both champions and the teams that are in the playoffs in hockey. And then you go and look in basketball, and conferences remain strong for a decade. The same names make it to the Final Four. Teams go and they make back-to-back finals, and they win champions, they become champions 2 or 3 out of 4 years. They make three-peats. There's just a lot more consistency in who wins and who goes deep in the NBA than there is in the NHL. And within this video, what they do is they find their own way to construe skill and luck, and their basic metric comes down to the notion, by the way, the video is going to be up there, it'll be in the description box below. The basic notion of what they do is they say, the way we'll judge how much skill there is how people do in the playoffs versus how they did in the regular season. So teams with very high records in the regular season, how often do they actually win the title? How often do they actually go deep in the tournament? And that's an interesting way, obviously, because the regular season is a massive sample size, to get a sense for how much luck there is involved in it. And in the end, what's funny is they end up showing on this diagram of how much skill and how much luck, hockey is the one that has the least amount of skill in terms of being able to consistently affect whether you win, and therefore are the best, and has more luck involved in it, which I think makes a lot of sense when you look at some of the best players. I mean, obviously, Ovechkin is one of the best players of all time, and he has never come close to winning an NHL, an NHL Cup, obviously, Stanley Cup, obviously. Whereas you go and you look at something like basketball is the sport that they end up putting at the most skill. And yes, the best players, if it's LeBron or Kobe or Michael Jordan, in general, the best players do win the titles and are able to push their teams to that extra level. Part of the reason in the sports example is obviously in basketball, you can play a lot more and you can focus the game around yourself a lot more. In hockey, you play on lines, you play less time. Defensive matchups are a lot more different. There's a lower sample size in terms of chances to score and win the game, whereas in basketball, you take a lot of shots. Anyway, you can watch the video if you want to see the basic point. But I thought the concept was very interesting because it's one you can absolutely go ahead and apply to esports. And so I thought I would break down esports titles in much the same way for the big titles. So in the same concept, we're using the metric of skill being the teams that we know are the best teams or among the better teams. How often do they actually win? How often do they actually consistently go deep? And what factors would play a role in that? And so I'm going to contrast CSGO, Starcraft Ii can count just as well, League of Legends, Dota 2, and Quake. So of these 5 games, in the end, the overall criteria, all things considered, I would rank them like this. And when I say Quake, I mean like Quake Live, Quake 3, but in general, the Quake series. Mostly the series count for these games. They're not too drastically different, although StarCraft 2 and Brood War certainly have some factors which could make it the one outlier. But in the end, I ranked it like this. We're going from most skilled, as in if you have a lot of skill, this makes you the most likely to win and go deepest in the tournament. And the ones at the end are the one that luck influences more than the skill of the other games. So we're going to go number 1 on the list is going to be Quake. Number 2 is going to be Csgo. Number 3 is Starcraft. Number 4 is Dota 2. And last place, number 5, is going to be League of Legends. So let's go through each game first of all, look at the pros and cons, and then we'll contrast each game against each other and see which factors go in which one's favour. So first of all, for Quake. Okay, so in terms of pros, first of all, it's a 1v1 game. That's much better for reducing luck. Now you're not worrying about what a teammate does. If you really are the best player, then in theory you can beat everyone ahead of you and you can continue to win and be the champion, as we saw with players like Rafa, 0-4, Thresh, Cooler, Toxic, who else have we got? Avec, Cypher, did I say Cypher already? The greatest players of all time can consistently win these games again and again and again. 1v1 definitely helps with that. Then you got to look at the map pool. The map pool has always been relatively small within these games, in contrast to CSGO or even worse to StarCraft, etc. And so, since it's a smaller map pool, mastery of 3 or 4 maps also gives you a massive chance of being able to win the tournament, to be able to go deep consistently. In the modern day of Quake, it was always played in best of 5 once you reached the playoff portion of the tournament. Now, in general, that is, because most of the tournaments are single elimination. QuakeCon, admittedly, would be sometimes best of 3, double elim. But best of 5 is much better overall than best of 3 for allowing someone, the better player, to win out. Whereas the better player could lose 2-1 in a best of 3, maybe since he's the better player, give him more games, he'll come back and win more of those best of 5 series where he was down 2-1. For example, I remember a series famously at the IEM 4 Global Finals where Rafa was down 0-2 and he's the best player at the time against Cypher, another very, very good player, and Rafa came back, won all 3 games and won the series 3-2. In a best of 3 format, he would have already been out of the tournament, Cypher would be in the final, and who knows what would have happened with that Cypher versus Cooler final. Certainly Cooler must be wondering that. Then you've got to consider, in Quake, there were no meta changes enforced by the devs. The developers of the game did not come in every few months, every year, and say, right, I'm going to switch this weapon and make it more powerful. Right, I'm going to switch up this component of how you move, etc. In general, the games were set at launch, and only a few minor things were tweaked every year or 2 along, so that the game remains fairly static. Fairly static game, again, reduces a lot of luck, because the luck of what the dev changes and whether it benefits you. It reduces the luck of everyone just starting over and resetting their knowledge in some aspect and having to learn again. And so if you are the better player, that can be more consistent over a longer period of time, and you can influence the game and have more of an impact based on how skilled you are. It also, this might sound like a cheating factor, but it really is a factor as to why the game had more skill involved, is it had a smaller player base. So you were only playing against the same 100 players, the same top 10 elite players in the world. You'd get to know those players very well. You get to know their tendencies. You could scout them. You could play off those. And if you were really the better player, there wasn't as much of a surprise factor of playing some guy you've never met before who became fantastically good in the last 6 months, or someone that you've only played twice in a year because the game's so huge in some of the global games that he's not in your country. So you haven't really got to play against this guy much. And then when you finally play against him, maybe he has the style mismatch that you would overcome if you played him 5 times in your career, but you only get to play him twice in the first couple of times he gets you. That doesn't exist in Quake. Finally, you've got to consider, in terms of the weapon mechanics, a lot less recoil, a lot less random elements, no real RNG involved aside from stuff like grenades. In Quake, even the projectile aspects of like the rocket launcher and the plasma gun to some degree is a lot of skill and technique involved in it. And so again, skill is able to dominate other weapons in this particular sense. Then you've got to consider the negatives of Quake. Okay, so first of all, there's the spawns. There isn't a slightly random element in that. Over time, the spawns were changed so that they weren't purely random, but there's an element in who gets to start first and then can take control of the map. But you play enough maps, the scoring system's long enough in terms of time limit, that overall, that tends to balance itself out. And finally, there's the spam element. Yes, in Quake, if you have a lot of ammunition, rockets, grenades, you do just spam sometimes, and you do, as a result, accidentally sometimes hit people. You can also kill people coming through teleporters. These are more random elements, but you notice they don't dominate the game in general. There's still an element of skill involved in them, and they don't tend to be what decides entire matches very often, especially not because you have best of 5. You have a small player base. It's 1v1. There's a map pool that everyone knows. These factors tend to overwhelmingly make that the most skilled game where the best player can consistently win, as seen by the fact that it took someone like Cooler, who was the 2nd or 3rd best player in the world, a long time in Quake Live to win a big international tournament, whereas Rafa and Cypher, the 2 greatest players of all time in Quake Live, continually won practically all the tournaments between themselves if you go and look overall. So second of all, CSGO. Now, first of all, for CSGO, A factor that goes in its favor is the scoring system. Now, this is something that goes in the favor of Quake as well, but in Quake it's offset by the spawns element, because you can spawn and start out in control, and that can change the scoring dynamic. One of the massive pros that CSGO has that no other game can boast is its scoring system. Because you play a minimum of 16 rounds. You play max rounds 15, first to get 16 wins. You play at least 16 discrete rounds, 16 rounds that are all separate. Now, they're connected in terms of the economy, but each one, in theory, depending on how much money you have and what weapons you have, can be a reset of the game. So as a result, famously, we've seen games where you could be down 0 to 10, but there's no momentum, there's no carryover to the next rounds. As long as you have the economy reset, or the economy built up from the loss bonus in CSGO, there's the factor that you could then win all 16 rounds after those 10 rounds and win 16 to 10. His 10 rounds didn't help him at that point in time, provided your economical position meant that you had the money to buy full weapons, armor, and grenades, etc. So the scoring system provides a larger sample size. It's comparable in this sense to what happens when you have basketball scoring compared to hockey scoring, which might be something like a MOBA. And in this sense, it's better even than Quake to allow the best teams in general to win out, to come back in the games, to grind games out, and to be able to win overall. Even though CS only uses best of 3 series, not best of 5 in most cases, it's a case that because of the scoring system, best of 3 tends to be good enough, or at least still better than best of 5 in League of Legends, for example. But because we have bans, 1 ban each at the beginning of the best of 3 series, that also tends to offset luck, because now if you're only good on 1 map but you're exceptionally good on it, you can't get lucky and just have that map if the opponent doesn't want you to. If the opponent is a much better and they're good on 4 or 5 out of the 7 maps, they can ban your best map, force you to pick something else, and then play you on the other maps and have a good chance to 2-0 you or win 2-1 anyway. So the best of 3 system with bans involved also makes CSGO a very skilled game, where as a result teams like Fnatic in 2015 very rarely lost best of 3 series to top level teams. There's also, as a result, yes, a lot of games have best of 3, but this ban system is one of the key elements. Now, Counter-Strike, while yes, it's not 1v1, conversely, the 5v5 element can in its own sense be a positive sometimes, because it does mean that you can win out more often if you're the better team, because you have so many good players that some of them can pick up the slack for the ones that aren't performing. That doesn't exist as much in 1v1, and while I say that makes the skill ultimately more pure in 1v1, there's an element to which it can offset it somewhat in 5v5 in that sense. Now, the cons for CSGO would be, first of all, you've got to look at the fact that it's 5v5. So contrasted against a 1v1 game, it can't really compare overall, because we know the best player can be trapped. I mean, one of the most extreme examples is last year, Nico was easily one of the top 2 or 3 players in the world, but he was stuck on mouse sports, which realistically was about the 8th or the 9th or the 10th best team in the world. And as such, he never made the final of a big international tournament. It never happened for him, and he was never going to have a chance to win a major, despite the fact, in theory, he was the best or second best player in the world. That doesn't happen in 1v1 games. He could just go ahead and win without the need of a team. Then you've got to consider that as much as bans and the veto system helps in best of 3, it actually hurts CSGO in terms of the skill element winning out in Swiss system and best of 1 round robin and group and GSL best of 1s. Because what happens is, since you ban out 3 maps and they ban out 3 maps and there's 1 map left out of the 7 in the pool, since they can ban 3, lower level teams can ban out nearly all of their weak maps, and even if the better team ban out a lot of their strong maps, odds are you're still going to end up in the middle of the map pool somewhere. You're going to end up on like the 4th, 5th, 6th best maps of a team. Maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th is more realistic. And so as a result, a team that in a best of 3 you would smash, because you could pick into their second weakest map and then get them on a tough map on the 3rd one. You'd probably beat them 2-0. In these scenarios, you can often get to a map that they can at least play. And so it makes best of 1s a lot more luck-based, a lot more random in that sense, and a lot less skill-based. And hence, you see a lot of best of 1 upsets in CSGO, in contrast to some of these other games. Then you've got to consider the economical aspect. Now, the economical aspect of how the money builds up and the fact that there's a loss bonus, so that people can be losing rounds and you're thrashing them 10-0, but now on certain rounds they're getting full money again and they get to reset and start all over again, that makes it so less about skill. If there was no loss bonus, then in theory, yes, the best team could just dominate even more. So that's a con of CSGO. Then you've got to add in the economical component also means that actually a game isn't decided by all 16 of the rounds won by the championship team, the winning team. It's actually decided by maybe 4 or 5 key rounds which either break the enemy's economy or bolster or boost your own economy or get a team back into a game from there which they can make a run. And it actually makes it so that, yes, the sample size of overall rounds is good, but a few of them become more important than other rounds, and they're not uniform in that particular sense as they might initially sound when you say you have 16 different rounds. Then you've got to, I mean, obviously the most famous example of this is the pistol round, which can really heavily affect who wins the game. And it's tough to win a map in which you lose both pistols. Then you've got to consider, moving out of FPS, we've got Starcraft Ii, we've got Brood War. We've got these games that are 1v1, so that's one of the great pros of the game. We know 1v1 overall, if I'm getting the best player to win, is probably the best approach. Also, Starcraft II, most famously, has used best of 5 a lot, and best of 5 is obviously on paper better than best of 3, even though the scoring system in CSGO has to be taken into account. So in best of 5 and sometimes best of 7 once you get to the finals in GSL style Code S tournaments, yeah, the better player is going to win most of the time here. The better player on that day is going to have a much better chance to win because he's got so many opportunities to. Now, the cons for StarCraft II, first of all, the scoring system is a huge problem because whereas in Quake and in Counter-Strike, you have so many opportunities, you have a length of time to win, or you have a certain amount of rounds to win, or you have all these opportunities to come back and to have your chance to win. In StarCraft II, a game is one thing, it is one entity. It doesn't matter if you're winning for 90% of a game. If you lose the game, you are down 0-1. You gain nothing from that. There's no carryover. You either win the game or you do not. And so as a result, in a best of 5, there are only 5 total chances to win or lose or to score a point. And so as a result, scoring is more limited and therefore luck increases in that particular sense. And it's less about overall skill. It's about winning at a certain point of the game as opposed to winning in each incremental moment of the game. There's no addition in that particular sense or cumulative effect. Then you've got to consider that in StarCraft II, the map pool changes on a fairly regular basis. And as such, you get maps in the pool that massively favor one side, one race, that massively favor a certain style of play. So if you have a different style of play, luck has now cost you chances to win or a chance to win by emphasizing an opponent or opponent's strength. Then you've got new maps, and so you have to start all over and learn again. So it's not just about pure skill as a player. Now it's about the skills of learning. Now it's about scouting the game, or sometimes being lucky in the guy who just discovers something early, even if you're not the most creative player. You've got to consider that the meta game is changed semi-regularly in StarCraft, which literally affects the units that are powerful, what they can do, and makes certain races more powerful or weaker than they were before. I mean, the most infamous era obviously would be towards the end of Wings of Liberty, the first StarCraft II, where the Broodlord Infestor era meant that even average European Zergs were having top placings, sometimes in tournaments with top Koreans. And in Korea, only godlike Terran players could actually go deep in tournaments and win them. And you just saw here how the metagame and the game balance affected by the developers directly contributed to who won tournaments in terms of which race could even win tournaments at that point in time. Now you go over to some of the MOBA games. So Dota 2, the pros that this game has, first of all, in terms of its format, it has a lot going for it. It has double elimination tournaments, so you get multiple chances to play the same opponent or to overcome a loss and still win the tournament. Famously, Evil Geniuses won something like 70 or 80% of their big titles during the PPD era coming from the lower bracket. So in other games, they would have been out already, and we could say that luck would play a bigger part in those other games in that sense of format than in Dota 2, where you got multiple chances and the better team did win out, ultimately given more chances. Then you've got to consider Dota 2 famously had a format where a lot of the tournaments had group stages which weren't about elimination or progression. Group stages which just decided seeding for the playoff bracket. So top half of the group made it into the upper half of the bracket, bottom half of the group went to the lower half of the bracket. You still had chances even after a poor group stage, and you played teams potentially 2 or 3 times in a tournament. Therefore, you had more opportunities to learn and for the better team to win out overall. overall. Then you've got to consider that the pick ban for the majority of Dota 2's lifespan was more advanced and skill-based than League of Legends, because there was more bans in Dota and they were staggered. So you did some bans, and you did some picks, and you did some bans. Whereas in League of Legends, you just had the 3 bans, you did them all at the beginning before anyone's picked, and then you pick all the champions of League of Legends one after another, or the 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, etc. Now, in terms of cons, first of all, Dota 2 also suffers from the scoring system. A game is one thing. If you come back, there's no bonus points for the guy who loses. There's nothing to build up. There's nothing to go into the next game with. They're just distinct things. And so you only have 3 options to score in a best of 3, 5 in a best of 5. Again, the meta can be heavily changed by the developers. Now, not as bad as Starcraft 2 or League of Legends, because Starcraft 2 has the problem of the race issue, meaning that if you don't play that race, then you can't just hop on the bandwagon or whatever's really strong. You can do that in Dota 2. And it's not as bad as League of Legends, in as much as League of Legends was more limited in the number of champions you could play because of how overpowered they would be within the game, and the fact that champions in general couldn't be swapped to different roles as much as in Dota 2. Now in Dota 2, a lot of the best players can switch up their champion pool when necessary. A lot of them play a lot of heroes, it should be hero pool, and a lot of them specifically can use different heroes in different roles. So it puts more strategy into the pick ban, and it also means that you can go ahead and take that strong hero and put it into a lesser role overall. Or a different role, and you could play Luna as a support instead of as mid. And then you've got the fact that another con is that Dota 2 is 5v5, so it can't really compete with 1v1 in that sense. A con is also that it had so many heroes, so as a result, there's a lot more things to be good at overall. So in a sense, it's not uniform in the way that something like Csgo or Counter-Strike are, where everyone's starting with the same basic utility and abilities and everything else, and it's just skill that decides it. No, now you're playing different heroes and champions and characters and all the rest of it. It's not uniform in that sense. That's a con. Finally, let's go to League of Legends. So in League of Legends, the pros are all the things mentioned before. There's not many of them, but okay. There's the fact that it has best of 5s that could be pretty good in a sense. There's the fact that it's a very global game, so in theory, you can come from almost anywhere and be very good. These are all good factors to a degree, but the problem is it doesn't have any pros over the other games. Now, in terms of cons, it has a lot. The scoring system, again, much like Dota, much like Starcraft 2, it's a distinct thing. Its meta changes, and it has the most radical meta changes. I mean, certain meta changes have literally capped the skill and impact ability of entire positions and roles. Think about the top lane in early Season 4, when everyone was running the defensive masteries, and it was Dr. Mundo, and it was Shyvana, and it was all these tank champions in the top lane. Then you have to remember the jungle in early Season 5, where they had this Cinder Hulk buff, so that now all these warrior jungle players suddenly got shit on, and you had to be able to play tanks in the jungle instead. Then we think of AD carry in Season 6, where the entire meta pretty much was utility and clean up AD carry champions and guys that weren't able to really smash lane and carry the whole game out from the... So if you're a player in one of these roles or positions who plays a different style from what the meta fits, you're either shit out of luck or your impact is so limited that you can no longer, by being the best at your role, necessarily decide your team wins the championship or goes the furthest in the tournaments. And so skill's certainly limited in that respect. Then you got to consider League of Legends has some very poor formats. It doesn't ever have double elimination. It's in a situation where you almost never have group stages that work for seeding. You have tournaments that are regional, and there's only a couple of chances to qualify for the couple of big tournaments on the international level. So you might be the best player. Like, for example, there's times where Forgiven could have been the best European player. The guy went to Worlds once ever, and arguably in the season when he wasn't at the peak of his powers. Likewise, Froggen in the past at times. Likewise, Flame in Korea and didn't ever go to a Worlds during his peak. Then you've got to consider the bans are even more topsy-turvy than in Dota, where there isn't that staggering of them. There wasn't the same aspect. Banning has so much more of an impact because of how overpowered certain champions and heroes are, and therefore you've got to worry about when you do it, and there's more of a luck element and a mind game element, not just pure skill as a player. Now what we'll do is let's contrast the games against each other based on factors and see which ones top out which categories. So first of all, in terms of the number of players who compete, obviously in general, as a general trend, having a 1v1 game is better than having a 5v5 game if you want the best players to win out in general. Now, as a result, Quake and Starcraft 2 beat out all the other games in that respect. But Starcraft 2 gets offset by the fact that CSGO's scoring system within the context of 5v5 and 1v1 is better than StarCraft 2's, and therefore I don't know that StarCraft 2 wins out ultimately beyond the number of players. So for example, that's one of the reasons why the number one sport actually for pure skill is tennis. Obviously it's a 1v1 sport, and the scoring system means that actually the best players do win out, and you have this ridiculous stat, you know, where Federer was in 27 straight semi-finals or something. You'll never see anything like that in Dota 2 or StarCraft 2 or CSGO. It would just be impossible to do. Then you've got to consider that there's the scoring system approach. So obviously a team game contrasted to tennis would be like the NFL. But in terms of scoring system, as a general rule, we want a larger sample size. So Quake and CSGO allow you to win 14-1, allow you to win 16-8, but have a comeback where you were down 0-8. The scoring system is better in these games and promotes skill more than luck compared to all the other games, which all have a distinct quality to it. So the real world contrast there would be the NBA, where you get all these shots you take in a game, maybe 90 shots and chances to score, and then however well you do it, your skill gets reflected over many more chances. There's more of a sample size. In the NHL, you might play fantastically for 90% of a game, have possession most of the time, have the most shots on goal, but he scores a lucky goal, he wins 1-0. The scoring opportunities are more limited. Luck is more prevalent in those games. I mean, just look at the Penguins winning this year. They probably shouldn't even have beaten the Ottawa Senators if you go and watch those games, but they had the luck at the right moments and they were able to win the cup overall. Meta changing. In general, the more the meta is changed and at the arbitrary whims of the dev, the less skill-based a game is going to be for individual players. Yes, the most skilled player of each meta might win in general as a general trend, but the problem is you might be the best player, but the meta goes against you and shifts against you, and what you like to do is limited, and therefore your opportunities to win are much less. So Quake and CSGO have the least meta changes by the dev on a drastic level, so they are the best in that sense over all the others. Then there's the aspect of how uniform are the characters. If you're in a game where you all start with the same type of character that can do the same things, that ultimately means that the best player will win out. In the other games, where there's different heroes and champions and types of things you can pick or races, now in this sense, it all depends whether you can win on what is strong at that time. You're again at the mercy of the meta. Finally, so as a result, Quake and CSGO obviously win out in that respect. There's the aspect of format. Now, in general, best of 5 is better than best of 3, but in CSGO that does even out a bit in the fact that it has a better scoring system in that game, and therefore best of 3 can be necessary, whereas sometimes best of 5 doesn't even seem that great at telling you who was the actual better team when League of Legends teams play sometimes. Now ultimately, Dota 2 wins out by far in this sense. It has by far the best formats with extra chances in the group and double eliminations. You can play the same opponent again, you can learn from your losses, and we've seen that some of the best teams of all time do come from the lower bracket and do very well, and some of the teams that are doing great in the upper bracket of internationals drop down and just get eliminated immediately, whereas they would have had a much higher placing in single elim. So it seems as though skill is promoted by these better formats. So overall, in general, it's going to be Dota 2, and then it's going to be, well, I mean, at this point in time, CSGO and Quake are sort of around the same level, and StarCraft 2 are on the same level, and then League of Legends last in terms of formats. There's veto systems. So in this respect, in Quake, StarCraft 2, and CSGO, you veto maps, and there's a more limited map size that generally tends to promote skill more. In MOBA games, you veto champions or heroes. There's so many of them. So much of it can be arbitrary to who you're playing against, and scouting information you can't have. And then it's obviously influenced by the meta. That makes that more luck-based overall, it would feel, than skill-based within these games, where we see a routine and how it helps you win doing these simple bans. Finally, I would say the player base. The more players, the more ultimately random the results will be overall, because there's so many people to compete against. Even if you're the best, you can't always win out, and there's more people. Could be a counter to you or counter to the person who beats you, and you get beaten by them who's slightly better than you, but then someone else wins. It becomes a clusterfuck. It becomes like trying to fly that small plane through a flock of birds and hope one doesn't go in the engine. So in general, yes, something like Quake that has less players. Yes, something like Starcraft that has less players overall, but obviously there was a lot in Korea. Games like League of Legends on the very end, there's so many players, and the formats are so simplistic and limited, and then you have the meta influencing things, and then you have the fact that the scoring is much more limited, and you can see how luck increases in these games. So all of these games have skilled players in them, I mean, just in terms of the fact League of Legends has more players in it, it might have more skilled players than any other esports game. But the point is, when we're trying to contrast, how do the best players fare in these games on average and over their whole careers? In general, there is more skill in games like Quake, in games like Csgo, in games like Starcraft Ii over the MOBA games of, for example, Dota and League of Legends. And it's not just about the game, it's also about the format that you're playing in. It's also about how the game is changed. It's also about aspects of how the scoring system works within the game. So, for example, Dota 2 is a fantastic game. It has a lot of depth to it, a lot of strategy, many different things that can be done, but the scoring system is clearly much more limited in finding who the best team or the best player is than something like CSGO overall.
Hello, I'm male feminist Anders Bloom, and because all lives matter here at Thorin's channel, I give you a big welcome.